Imagine this. You're sitting on a plane, moments away from takeoff to your dream destination, when a simple misunderstanding spirals out of control. Suddenly, you're asked to leave the plane by a flight attendant who shows not an ounce of respect or patience. What would you do if you weren't just an ordinary passenger? Sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened to one unsuspecting traveler. Except he wasn't your average passenger. What if I told you that the man thrown off that flight wasn't just a wealthy businessman, but someone powerful enough to change the fate of an entire airline in the blink of an eye? Why would a billionaire be kicked off a plane? And what happens when someone with the power to buy an entire airline decides to teach a lesson to those who crossed him? You won't believe what happens next. Stay tuned as we unravel a gripping tale of revenge, power, and a business mogul who refused to let disrespect slide. How far will he go? You won't want to miss the jaw-dropping twists that lie ahead. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. Is the weather chilly where you are? If so, be sure to bundle up and stay warm. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another inspiring story like this. Let's get started. It was a breezy Thursday afternoon at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, one of the busiest hubs in the world. The terminal hummed with the usual chaos. Passengers dragging suitcases, announcements crackling over the intercom, and flight crews rushing to make tight turnarounds. Among the crowd, Gate 47 was preparing for Flight AR-112 to London, a prime business route operated by Polaris Air, a mid-tier airline known for its efficiency, but not exactly for luxury. Edward Whitehall stepped through the terminal unnoticed. Dressed in a tailored yet modest navy suit, he looked more like an average executive than the tech titan he was. There was no entourage, no ostentatious display of wealth. Just a man with a leather briefcase slung casually over one shoulder. To onlookers, he was another business traveler among many. Yet this unassuming figure was worth billions. Edward had built a tech empire from scratch, with ventures in AI, cloud computing, and green technology. However, he preferred anonymity and had no interest in the public limelight. As he approached the gate, he paused briefly to glance at his watch. He was early, as always. Punctuality was one of his trademarks. Scanning his boarding pass on his phone, he stepped into the boarding area and took a seat in the business class lounge. Around him, other passengers chatted quietly or scrolled through their phones. For Edward, this was another routine trip across the Atlantic. Nothing unusual, or so he thought. At the same time, Clara Harper was having what could only be described as a nightmare of a shift. A flight attendant for Polaris Air for the past 6 years, Clara was known for her diligence and adherence to protocol. She had earned a reputation as a stickler for the rules, though it often made her less popular with passengers and even some of her colleagues. That day, however, her usually composed demeanor was wearing thin. A cascade of flight delays earlier in the day had turned her schedule into a logistical nightmare, leaving her scrambling from one gate to the next. As she strode into the jet bridge to begin pre-boarding checks, Clara's head was pounding. Another argument with the catering staff over a missing meal tray had left her even more irritated. Worse, her co-pilot had made an offhand comment about how she needed to lighten up, a remark she couldn't shake off. Now, standing in the aircraft aisle, Clara inhaled deeply, trying to reset her nerves. She straightened her uniform, adjusted her scarf, and plastered on a smile, though it felt more forced than usual. This flight had to go smoothly. No room for errors. Not today. Edward Whitehall settled into the plush seat of row 3, his mind already shifting gears to the upcoming business summit in London. His tablet, sleek and loaded with files, had become his constant companion for long flights, a tool that kept him sharp and efficient. The sound of passengers boarding, the announcements crackling overhead. These were just white noise to him as he sifted through critical details for his upcoming pitch. As he tapped away on his device, the boarding process continued in the background. Clara Harper, still reeling from her day's challenges, had finished welcoming passengers and was now performing her aisle checks. To an outsider, she seemed poised, moving briskly between rows. But beneath her professional exterior, her patience was thinning rapidly. When she reached row 3, she spotted Edward engrossed in his screen. A faint glow emanated from the device, clearly still active despite the pre-departure announcement instructing all passengers to switch devices to airplane mode. Clara stopped in her tracks, her brows furrowing slightly. She prided herself on enforcing rules, seeing it as part of her duty to ensure safety. Today, though, her diligence carried an edge born from fatigue. "Excuse me, sir," Clara said, her voice firm but polite. "Please switch your device to airplane mode." Edward barely registered her words, his attention fixated on a chart that refused to align correctly. He gave a distracted nod and murmured, "Of course," without looking up. Clara waited a moment, expecting action. None came. To her, his lack of urgency wasn't just frustrating, it felt dismissive. As someone who worked hard to maintain authority in a high-stress environment, Clara was unaccustomed to being ignored, even unintentionally. "Sir," she repeated, this time with more insistence, "you need to switch your device now. It's a safety regulation." Her tone broke through Edward's focus, and he glanced up, the confusion evident in his expression. "Pardon me?" he asked, momentarily caught off guard. Clara gestured to his tablet. "Your device. It needs to be in airplane mode before we depart." Realizing his oversight, Edward nodded again. My apologies. I must have missed the announcement. Let me take care of it." He began swiping at the screen, navigating the menus to find the setting. But the moment had already stretched too long for Clara's liking. Her day's frustrations bubbled over, and the slight delay now felt like defiance. "Sir," she said, her voice adopting a sharper edge, "this isn't optional. Compliance with crew instructions is mandatory." Edward paused, his fingers hovering over the screen. He looked up at Clara fully now, a hint of incredulity flickering across his face. Her words were needlessly stern, and the intensity of her stance struck him as disproportionate to the situation. He had encountered demanding professionals before, but there was something personal in her tone that bristled against his sense of calm. "There's no need to raise your voice," he said evenly, maintaining his composure. "I've already said I'll handle it." Clara's jaw tightened. To her, his response lacked sincerity. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, those who tested boundaries, who believed they were above the rules. She had no way of knowing that Edward wasn't just another difficult traveler. All she saw was a man who appeared indifferent to her authority. "I'm going to have to insist," she said, her voice firm and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "If you can't comply immediately, I'll have to inform the captain." The shift in her tone drew the attention of several passengers seated nearby. Heads turned, whispers began, and the cabin filled with an air of quiet tension. Edward noticed the sudden attention and felt a flicker of irritation. He had worked his entire career to avoid public scenes, valuing discretion above all else. This situation, so minor in his eyes, was now becoming unnecessarily theatrical. "There's really no need for all of this," Edward replied, keeping his tone measured. "I've already complied." Clara crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. "I don't think you're taking this seriously," she said. "I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane." The words were like a jolt to the cabin. The nearby passengers froze, their whispers silenced by the gravity of Clara's statement. Edward stared at her, momentarily stunned. He had been asked to do many things in his life: negotiate billion-dollar deals, lead boardrooms full of skeptics, but never had he been asked to leave a plane for what he perceived as a trivial misunderstanding. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice calm, but tinged with disbelief. "Completely," Clara replied, her posture rigid. "This flight operates under strict protocols, and passengers who refuse to cooperate with crew instructions are not allowed to remain on board." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, he weighed his options. He could argue, but that would only escalate the scene Clara seemed determined to create. He could demand to speak with her superior, but that would draw more attention than he was comfortable with. Public humiliation was something he avoided at all costs, even if it meant swallowing his pride. "Very well," he said at last, rising smoothly from his seat. "If that's how you'd like to handle this." Grabbing his briefcase, he adjusted his jacket and stepped into the aisle. The nearby passengers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. unsure of how to interpret the situation. Clara stepped aside to let him pass, her expression resolute. As Edward exited the plane and stepped back into the terminal, a strange calm settled over him. He wasn't one to let anger cloud his judgment, but this incident gnawed at him. The flight attendant's tone, the spectacle she had made, the sheer audacity of being treated as though he were a problem to be removed. It all felt deeply wrong. Edward Whitehall stood near a massive glass window in Atlanta's bustling Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, his reflection barely visible against the backdrop of a vibrant sunset. The plane he had just been ejected from was now taxiing down the runway, its engines humming faintly through the thick pane of glass. Passengers and crew aboard remained oblivious to the small but significant drama that had unfolded just moments earlier. Edward wasn't angry in the conventional sense. He was a man who had long mastered the art of controlling his emotions, channeling frustration into productive energy. But this was something different. There was a unique sting in being publicly dismissed over what he considered a trivial misunderstanding. It wasn't the inconvenience or the delay that bothered him. It was the principle of the matter. He had built his empire on precision, respect, and control. Today, Clara Harper, a flight attendant he had never met, had stripped him of all three in a matter of minutes. Reaching into the pocket of his tailored jacket, Edward pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts with practiced ease until he reached the name Victor Turner. Victor was more than just Edward's lawyer. He was a trusted confidant who had been by his side for every major business deal of the last decade. The phone rang twice before Victor's smooth, measured voice answered. "Edward, I take it you've landed safely in London?" "Not quite," Edward replied, his tone clipped but calm. "I'm still in Atlanta. Something unexpected happened." There was a brief pause on the other end. Victor had worked with Edward long enough to recognize when something significant was brewing. "Go on," he said, his voice softening slightly. Edward recounted the incident in precise detail. He spoke without embellishment or dramatics, describing the interaction with Clara and the escalating series of misunderstandings that led to his removal from the flight. Victor listened in silence, letting Edward lay out the events without interruption. When Edward finished, there was a moment of quiet. "So, what do you want to do about this?" Victor finally asked, his tone cautious. Edward turned from the window, his gaze sweeping across the terminal. People moved with purpose, rushing to catch flights or greet loved ones. But Edward's mind was already somewhere else. "I want to ensure that this never happens again," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Edward," Victor said carefully, "if you're looking for an apology, I can draft a—" "I'm not interested in apologies," Edward interrupted. "Or compensation. This isn't about a refund or some hollow gesture of goodwill. This is about respect." There was another pause. Victor's voice, when it returned, was laced with curiosity. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Edward took a slow breath, as though weighing the words before speaking them aloud. "I want the airline." Victor blinked on the other end of the call, stunned into silence. He had witnessed Edward make bold moves before. Hostile takeovers, rapid acquisitions, even last-minute bids for companies teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. But this was different. It wasn't just a business decision. It was personal. "Polaris Air," Victor said slowly, as if testing the words. "You're serious?" "I am," Edward replied. "The airline operates in a fragmented market. It's mid-tier, with potential for expansion, but no clear vision. The incident today only highlights the cracks in their system. Poor training, a lack of focus on customer relations, and a culture of complacency. It's ripe for acquisition. And you think buying an airline over a personal slight is a sound investment?" Victor asked, though his tone was less skeptical than curious. "This isn't just about the incident," Edward said, his voice firm. "It's about taking control, turning weakness into opportunity. If they can treat me, someone with resources and influence, this way, imagine how they treat ordinary customers. The entire operation needs to be overhauled." Victor leaned back in his leather chair, tapping a pen against the edge of his desk. "It's ambitious. Airlines aren't exactly easy acquisitions. They're tied up in regulations, unions, and complex financial structures. Not to mention, this will attract a lot of attention." "Good," Edward replied simply. Let them pay attention. This is about more than just Polaris Air. It's a statement. Victor couldn't help but smile at the determination in Edward's voice. He had seen this side of his client before, the unrelenting focus, the calm confidence that came from knowing precisely what he wanted. All right, Victor said, if you're serious about this, I'll get the ball rolling. We'll need to start with share acquisition. Quietly. Build a stake without tipping off the board. I'll leave the details to you, Edward said, already thinking several steps ahead. But move quickly. I want this done before anyone realizes what's happening. Victor jotted down a series of notes, his mind already racing through the logistics. I'll put together a team tonight. You'll need financial backing, PR strategies, and whatever it takes, Edward said, cutting him off. Spare no resources. Understood, Victor replied. But Edward, this won't be an easy fight. The board will resist. The unions will push back. And the media will have a field day once they catch wind of this. I'm counting on it, Edward said with a faint smile. Let them resist. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll already be over. After ending the call, Edward sat down at a quiet corner of the terminal, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He wasn't one to dwell on emotions, but he couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction that came with knowing he was about to turn an insult into an empire. The airline industry had always intrigued him. It was a space ripe for innovation, yet bogged down by inefficiency and outdated practices. Edward had stayed away from it, deeming it too volatile and resistant to change. But now, the challenge felt irresistible. He opened his tablet and began typing, creating a blueprint for the transformation he envisioned. He made notes on customer service protocols, operational streamlining, and the integration of cutting-edge technology. In his mind, Polaris Air wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a platform to demonstrate what real leadership looked like. Hours later, Victor was already assembling a team. Calls were made to trusted advisors, financial analysts, and corporate strategists. Emails buzzed back and forth as the groundwork for the acquisition began to take shape. Polaris Air's stock prices were analyzed, its vulnerabilities exposed, and its key shareholders identified. By midnight, Edward was back in his private suite, reviewing the initial reports Victor had sent over. The airline was smaller than he expected, with limited routes and declining customer satisfaction scores. But the weaknesses only fueled his determination. To Edward, this wasn't just about fixing a flawed company. It was about proving that he could turn it into a global powerhouse. As the city lights of Atlanta flickered outside his window, Edward closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. The events of the day played back in his mind. Clara's dismissive tone, the startled faces of the passengers, the quiet disbelief as he exited the plane. They had all underestimated him. That was their first mistake. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, Edward Whitehall's private office in downtown Atlanta buzzed with quiet urgency. His decision to acquire Polaris Air had set a complex plan into motion, one that required precision, speed, and an uncompromising will to dominate the game before anyone else knew they were playing. Victor Turner sat across from Edward, flipping through a stack of documents outlining the airline's current financial state. Their stock is undervalued, Victor began, and they've had a few operational setbacks recently. That works in our favor, but their board isn't going to take this lying down. Edward leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the plan's next steps. I don't expect them to, he replied calmly. This isn't about asking for permission. We'll make an offer so compelling that resistance will only delay the inevitable. By midday, Edward's financial team, led by his trusted strategist Amanda Sloan, was already deep into the process of acquiring shares. Amanda was a no-nonsense financial genius, known for her ability to navigate the murkiest waters of corporate finance. Her team worked in tandem with Victor's legal experts, ensuring every transaction was airtight. We're starting small, Amanda explained during a strategy call. Incremental purchases under different holding entities to avoid drawing attention. Once we reach 20% ownership, we'll initiate a more aggressive push. Timeline? Edward asked, his tone sharp but composed. 10 days for majority control, if everything goes as planned, Amanda replied confidently. but we'll need to account for variables, media leaks, shareholder hesitance, or interference from the board. Edward nodded. I want contingencies for every scenario. No surprises. 2 days later, Polaris Air's CEO, Robert Carlyle, paced the sleek boardroom at the company's Chicago headquarters. The news had just broken. A sudden surge in stock purchases, seemingly unrelated, but too coordinated to be random. The financial press was speculating about a takeover, and Robert's phone had been ringing nonstop. This isn't a coincidence, Robert said, addressing the board members seated around the long table. Someone's making a play for us, and they're doing it quickly. What's the strategy here? Asked Elaine Parker, the company's CFO. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety. Do we know who's behind this? Not yet, Robert admitted, but I've instructed our legal team to investigate. If we can identify the buyer, we might be able to block them. Assuming we can afford to fight back, Elaine countered. If this is a hostile takeover, the financial burden alone could cripple us. Robert ran a hand through his graying hair. We're not going to roll over, he said firmly. Not without a fight. Back in Atlanta, Edward's team had shifted gears. With nearly 25% of Polaris Air's shares now under his control, it was time to reveal his intentions. A formal letter of intent was drafted, outlining Edward's bid to acquire the remaining shares at a premium price. The offer was delivered directly to Polaris Air's boardroom, where it landed like a grenade. Robert Carlyle read the letter twice before tossing it onto the table. Edward Whitehall, he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. The tech billionaire. What's his angle? Elaine asked, picking up the letter and scanning it. He's never been involved in aviation. Why us? It's not about us, Robert said bitterly. It's about him. This is personal. What do we do? Another board member asked. Robert paused, then straightened his posture. We hold an emergency meeting. No statements to the press, no leaks. We need to assess our position before we make any moves. 3 days later, Edward arrived at Polaris Air's headquarters, his entrance as unassuming as ever. Victor Turner and Amanda Sloan flanked him, both carrying slim briefcases that held the key details of the acquisition plan. The tension in the boardroom was palpable as Edward took his seat across from Robert Carlyle and the other board members. Mr. Whitehall, Robert began, his tone icy but measured. I assume you're aware of the disruption your actions have caused. Edward met his gaze without flinching. Disruption is often a precursor to progress, he said simply. I'm here to discuss the future of Polaris Air. And you believe that future involves you? Robert shot back. I don't believe, Edward replied calmly. I know. Polaris Air is operating far below its potential. Its inefficiencies are glaring, its customer satisfaction metrics are stagnant, and its vision for the future is non-existent. That changes under my leadership. Robert's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. And if we decline your offer? Edward leaned forward, his expression unyielding. Then I'll increase my stake to 51% and bypass this conversation entirely. This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Carlyle. It's an inevitability. After the meeting, Polaris Air's board retreated to discuss their options. Robert was visibly frustrated, pacing the room as his colleagues debated the best course of action. If we refuse, he'll make good on his threat, Elaine said. He's already holding nearly a third of our shares. Blocking him will cost us millions, and even then, it might not work. And if we accept? Another board member asked. Elaine hesitated. Then we walk away with a substantial payout, but we lose control. Robert slammed his hand on the table. This is our airline. We can't just hand it over because some billionaire throws money at us. It's more than money, Elaine replied carefully. It's strategy, and frankly, it's brilliant. He's identified every weakness in our operation and positioned himself as the solution. The shareholders will side with him if it comes to that. The board's deliberations stretched into the night, but Edward wasn't concerned. Back in his hotel suite, he reviewed a detailed dossier Amanda had prepared on each board member. He knew their motivations, their fears, and the leverage points that would guide their decisions. For Edward, this wasn't just business. It was chess, and he was always 3 moves ahead. By the next morning, Polaris Air's board had no choice but to respond. Robert Carlyle, flanked by his legal counsel, called Edward directly. "We've reviewed your offer," Robert said, his tone begrudgingly formal. "We'll need assurances about your plans for the company." "You'll have them," Edward replied. "But let me be clear. This is a takeover, not a partnership. I'll respect the airline's legacy, but its future will be under my direction." Robert's silence spoke volumes, but he finally relented. "Fine. We'll present your proposal to the shareholders." As Edward ended the call, a rare flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. The groundwork was laid, and the pieces were falling into place. Polaris Air's leadership had underestimated him, but by the time they realized the full extent of his ambition, it would be too late to stop him. The acquisition was no longer just an idea. It was a reality, and Edward Whitehall was about to reshape the aviation industry in his image. The sun hung low over Chicago's skyline as Edward Whitehall stepped into the gleaming conference room of Polaris Air's corporate headquarters. The air inside was tense, charged with uncertainty. Just 48 hours ago, the airline shareholders had voted overwhelmingly in favor of Edward's acquisition bid. Now the company belonged to him. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a victory, one that reasserted Edward's control over his narrative and opened the door to something much bigger. Yet, as he entered the room, flanked by Victor Turner and Amanda Sloan, Edward knew that the hardest part was just beginning. Winning control was one thing. Reshaping the culture of a company entrenched in old habits was an entirely different battle. Seated around the long mahogany table were the key figures of Polaris Air's leadership team. Executives who had weathered years of turbulence, both literal and figurative. At the head of the table sat Robert Carlyle, his resignation effective at the close of the meeting. He looked composed but defeated, the weight of the past weeks etched into his features. "Good afternoon, everyone," Edward said, his tone even but commanding as he walked to the head of the table. He placed his leather briefcase on the table and clasped his hands in front of him. "Let's get right to it." Edward scanned the room, his sharp gaze meeting the eyes of each executive. Some looked nervous, others defiant. He had expected resistance. Change always provoked fear. "Let me start by saying this. Polaris Air has potential," Edward began. His voice was calm, steady, but with an undeniable edge. "But potential is meaningless without leadership, vision, and execution. That's why I'm here." He glanced at Robert, giving the outgoing CEO a brief nod. "Mr. Carlyle has led this company through challenging times, and I acknowledge his contributions. However, we can all agree that Polaris Air has been treading water for far too long." Robert's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Edward continued, his voice sharpening. "That is today. From this moment forward, Polaris Air will not be just another airline. We will set the standard for efficiency, customer satisfaction, and innovation. And we will achieve this by making bold, decisive changes." One of the executives, Mark Hendricks, Polaris Air's VP of Operations, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mr. Whitehall, the airline industry isn't exactly a playground for tech-driven innovation. There are regulations, unions, and—" Edward raised a hand, cutting him off. "I understand the complexities of this industry, Mr. Hendricks. I didn't acquire Polaris Air to play games. I acquired it because I see opportunities where others see obstacles." Mark fell silent, his face reddening slightly. Edward stepped forward, his voice growing firmer. "Let me make one thing clear. Mediocrity will no longer be tolerated at Polaris Air. Those who cling to the old way of doing things will find themselves left behind. If you're not prepared to adapt, you're free to leave." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the table. Edward opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Amanda Sloan distributed them to each executive, her efficient movements underscoring the seriousness of the moment. "These are our immediate priorities," Edward said, gesturing to the documents. "Customer service metrics will be overhauled. Training programs will be revised to emphasize professionalism and empathy. Operational inefficiencies, delays, poor maintenance scheduling, and redundant workflows will be eradicated." Elaine Parker, the CFO, skimmed through the papers, her brows furrowing. Some of these changes will require significant investments, she said cautiously. Have you considered? I've considered everything, Edward interrupted. And I'm willing to invest whatever it takes to make Polaris Air the most respected airline in the industry. That said, every dollar spent will be tracked and accounted for. Wasteful spending stops now. Edward turned to Amanda, giving her a nod. She stepped forward with a smaller set of documents, distributing them to the group. These, Edward said, are new policies designed to reshape the company's culture. Respect and accountability will be non-negotiable. From the ground crew to the executive team, every employee will be held to the highest standards. He leaned forward slightly, his voice softening but gaining a steely edge. I want every passenger who steps onto one of our planes to feel valued. I want every employee to take pride in the work they do. And I want every competitor to envy what we've built. As Edward spoke, he couldn't ignore the tension radiating from Robert Carlyle. The former CEO shifted in his seat, his expression tight. When Edward finished outlining his vision, Robert finally spoke. Mr. Whitehall, Robert began, his voice carefully measured. With all due respect, you can't expect to rebuild an airline overnight. These changes, radical as they are, require time and resources that this company may not have. Edward regarded Robert for a moment before responding. You're right. Change doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with leadership. He stood straight and glanced around the room. Effective immediately, Mr. Carlyle will be stepping down. His leadership, while commendable in certain respects, is no longer aligned with the direction Polaris Air needs to take. Robert stiffened, but said nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Edward's dismissal of the former CEO was a calculated move, a signal to everyone in the room that he was unafraid to make difficult decisions. As the meeting drew to a close, Edward stood to address the team one final time. This is your moment to decide, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. If you believe in the potential of this company and are willing to work for it, I welcome you to stay. But if you're not prepared to embrace these changes, then this is where our paths diverge. He paused, letting his words sink in. I didn't acquire Polaris Air to maintain the status quo. I acquired it to create something extraordinary. I expect nothing less from each of you. With that, he gathered his documents and left the room, Victor and Amanda close behind. The remaining executives sat in stunned silence, exchanging glances as they absorbed the weight of what had just transpired. As Edward stepped into the elevator, Victor turned to him. You certainly know how to make an entrance, he said with a wry smile. It wasn't about the entrance, Edward replied. It was about the message. And the message was clear. Polaris Air was no longer the same airline. Under Edward Whitehall's leadership, it would become a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of excellence, determination, and unrelenting vision. The atrium of Polaris Air's training headquarters in Dallas was unusually crowded. Rows of seats were lined with employees, from seasoned pilots to flight attendants fresh out of training. The gathering wasn't ordinary. It had been called by Polaris Air's new owner, Edward Whitehall, and no one was quite sure what to expect. In the days following Edward's takeover, whispers of change had swept through the company. His decisive actions had already claimed one high-profile casualty, former CEO Robert Carlyle. Now, the workforce braced for the next chapter in the airline's transformation. At the center of this storm, however, was someone far removed from the boardrooms and executive decisions. Clara Harper, the flight attendant whose fateful interaction with Edward had set everything in motion, sat in the middle row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had been summoned without explanation, and the air around her was thick with anticipation. Her colleagues exchanged furtive glances, some whispering her name as the meeting began. Edward Whitehall entered the room with his usual quiet authority. Dressed in a crisp black suit, he moved to the podium without acknowledging the murmurs that rippled through the audience. His team, including Victor Turner and Amanda Sloan, stood nearby, their expressions impassive. Good morning, Edward began, his voice calm but commanding. Over the past week, Polaris Air has embarked on a journey of transformation. We are setting new standards for excellence, accountability, and professionalism, standards that must be upheld by everyone, at every level. He paused, letting his words settle. The room grew still. Today, he continued, we address an incident that reflects why these changes are necessary. An incident that demonstrated a lack of professionalism and respect, qualities that are non-negotiable in this company. Clara's stomach sank. She felt every eye in the room shift toward her, though Edward hadn't mentioned her name. Her pulse quickened as he continued. Edward gestured to a screen behind him, where a brief video clip began to play. It was security footage from the terminal on the day Clara had ejected him from the flight. The audio had been enhanced, capturing the tone of their exchange. Though Edward had remained calm throughout, Clara's sharp, authoritative tone painted her actions in an unflattering light. As you can see, Edward said, narrating the footage, this incident was not just a misunderstanding. It was a failure to uphold the values that Polaris Air should stand for. Respect, professionalism, and composure are the pillars of this company, and when they are compromised, the consequences are far-reaching. The clip ended, leaving the room in heavy silence. Clara felt a rush of heat in her cheeks, her embarrassment mounting. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her voice seemed stuck in her throat. Edward turned back to the audience, his expression firm but not unkind. Let me be clear. This is not about assigning blame for a single mistake. This is about setting an example. As we rebuild Polaris Air, there can be no room for behavior that undermines our mission. He looked directly at Clara for the first time, his gaze unyielding. Ms. Harper, your actions were unprofessional and unacceptable. Effective immediately, your employment with Polaris Air is terminated. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the building's air conditioning felt deafening. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the words landed. Her colleagues sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and discomfort. But, Mr. Whitehall, Clara began, her voice trembling. Edward raised a hand, silencing her. I appreciate your service to this company, but this is not a negotiation. The standards we set today will define the future of Polaris Air, and unfortunately, your actions do not align with those standards. As the meeting concluded, Clara sat in stunned silence while the room emptied. She wanted to cry, to shout, to plead her case, but deep down, she knew it was futile. Her career in the aviation industry, one she had worked so hard to build, had come to an abrupt and devastating end. Outside the room, her colleagues whispered in hushed tones. Some expressed sympathy, others shrugged, calling it an inevitable outcome. For Clara, the humiliation was almost unbearable. Not only had she been fired, but it had happened in such a public and dramatic way that there was no escaping the fallout. That evening, Clara sat alone in her small Dallas apartment, replaying the events of the day in her mind. Her termination had been swift and merciless, but what stung the most was the way Edward Whitehall had framed it. Not as a personal vendetta, but as a lesson for everyone else. She glanced at the pile of airline memorabilia she had collected over the years. Crew badges, certificates of commendation, even a framed photo of her graduating from flight attendant training. They now felt like relics of a life she could no longer return to. I didn't deserve this, she muttered to herself, though a small voice inside her wasn't so sure. Had she been too harsh? Too quick to assert her authority without considering the consequences? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her actions on that fateful day had been fueled by frustration and exhaustion, emotions that had clouded her judgment. But understanding didn't make the loss any easier to bear. Meanwhile, Edward sat in his private office, reflecting on the meeting. Dismissing Clara hadn't been an easy decision, but he believed it was a necessary one. Her actions had exposed a larger cultural problem within the company, one that needed to be addressed decisively. She'll bounce back, Victor said, sensing Edward's unease. Maybe not in this industry, but she's young. She'll find her way. Edward nodded but said nothing. Despite his confidence in the decision, he couldn't shake a lingering thought. Clara's behavior, though unprofessional, had been a symptom of a system that had failed its employees. If Polaris Air was going to succeed, he would need to ensure that no one else reached the breaking point Clara had. For Clara, the days that followed were a blur of emotions. anger, sadness, and regret. She applied to other airlines, only to face rejection after rejection. Word of her dismissal had spread quickly, and her once bright future in aviation now seemed out of reach. But as the weeks went on, she began to rebuild in small ways. She enrolled in a professional development course, hoping to gain new skills. She volunteered at a local community center, finding solace in helping others. Slowly, Clara started to see her termination not just as an ending, but as a turning point. For Edward, Clara's dismissal became a symbol, a reminder of why his mission at Polaris Air mattered. As he pushed forward with sweeping reforms, he often thought of her, determined to ensure that the company he was building would leave no room for failures like the one she had experienced. The lesson was clear. Mistakes had consequences, but so did leadership. And for both Edward and Clara, the road ahead was one of transformation. Edward Whitehall stood in Polaris Air's main conference room, gazing out at the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. The energy in the room was different now. Weeks had passed since his dramatic acquisition and the public dismissal of Clara Harper. While the initial turbulence had subsided, a new challenge loomed: rebuilding the airline's fractured culture. It wasn't revenge that motivated Edward anymore. The fire that had driven his aggressive takeover had been replaced by something more meaningful: a vision of transformation. Polaris Air had the potential to be more than just a mid-tier airline. It could be a beacon of innovation, respect, and excellence. But to achieve that, Edward knew he needed to start with the people. Edward's first step was a comprehensive culture audit. Amanda Sloan had taken charge of the project, working alongside Dr. Elena Warren, a behavioral psychologist specializing in corporate restructuring. Together, they surveyed employees across all levels of the company, from pilots and flight attendants to ground crews and administrative staff. The results were sobering. Employees described the company as rigid, hierarchical, and reactive. Many felt overworked, undervalued, and disconnected from their roles. Customer service representatives admitted to burnout, while flight crews reported feeling unsupported by management. "These numbers don't lie," Elena said during a presentation to Edward and the executive team. "The culture here is eroding from within. If you don't fix it, any changes you make will collapse under the weight of employee dissatisfaction." Edward nodded, absorbing the data. "Then let's fix it," he said simply. The next week, Edward unveiled the Polaris Promise, a new set of guiding principles designed to reshape the company's identity. The announcement came during an all-hands meeting broadcast across every Polaris Air hub. Standing on a small stage in the hangar-turned auditorium, Edward spoke directly to the employees. "Polaris Air is not just an airline," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "It's a promise to our customers, to our partners, and most importantly, to each of you. Today, we begin a new chapter, one that prioritizes respect, collaboration, and innovation." The Polaris Promise had 3 pillars. 1. Respect at every level. Employees would be treated as valuable contributors, with their voices heard and their well-being prioritized. 2. Customer experience above all. Every passenger interaction would reflect the airline's commitment to excellence and empathy. 3. Continuous growth. Opportunities for professional development and innovation would be provided at every stage of an employee's career. As Edward spoke, he could see a shift in the audience. Some employees looked skeptical, their arms crossed, while others seemed intrigued, even hopeful. He knew this wouldn't be an overnight transformation, but it was a start. To reinforce the Polaris Promise, Edward initiated a series of training programs aimed at improving both customer service and employee morale. Sophia Martinez, a former hospitality executive with a reputation for revitalizing struggling organizations, was brought in to lead the effort. Sophia's first move was to revamp the training curriculum for flight attendants and customer service staff. Role-playing exercises focused on empathy and conflict resolution, while workshops encouraged employees to share their experiences and collaborate on solutions. "For too long, you've been reacting to problems instead of anticipating them," Sophia told a group of trainees during her first session. "Our goal isn't just to meet expectations, it's to exceed them." Edward also recognized that improving morale required addressing the root causes of employee dissatisfaction. He introduced several well-being initiatives, including flexible scheduling. Pilots and flight crews were given more input into their schedules, reducing burnout and improving work-life balance. Mental health support. A new partnership with a national counseling service offered employees access to free therapy sessions and stress management workshops. Recognition programs. Monthly awards celebrated employees who went above and beyond, creating a culture of appreciation. To ensure these changes took root, Edward mandated quarterly town hall meetings where employees could voice concerns and provide feedback directly to leadership. The first of these meetings saw hesitant participation, but as the weeks went on, more employees began to speak up, encouraged by the tangible improvements they were already seeing. On the customer-facing side, Edward knew that Polaris Air's reputation for mediocre service needed to be overhauled. He introduced a new customer experience program called Skyline Smiles, which focused on 3 key areas. 1. Proactive communication. Passengers would receive real-time updates about delays, gate changes, and baggage information through a revamped app and improved communication channels. 2. Personalized service. Frequent flyers were offered tailored perks, such as personalized greetings and pre-selected amenities. 3. Onboard comfort. Polaris Air began retrofitting its aircraft with more spacious seating, upgraded in-flight entertainment, and healthier meal options. The program's launch was paired with a public marketing campaign featuring the tagline, "Fly with Polaris. Fly with purpose." Not everyone embraced the changes immediately. Some executives privately questioned Edward's approach, worried that the investments in training and well-being would hurt the company's bottom line. Others, like Mark Hendricks, the VP of Operations, openly voiced their doubts during leadership meetings. "With all due respect, Edward," Mark said during one heated discussion, "this is an airline, not a luxury spa. We should be focusing on efficiency, not coddling employees." Edward met Mark's gaze evenly. "Efficiency doesn't come from overworked and undervalued employees," he replied. "If you want results, you need people who are motivated to achieve them. That starts with respect." Over time, even skeptics like Mark couldn't argue with the results. Employee turnover decreased, and customer satisfaction scores began to climb steadily. Shareholders, initially wary of Edward's unconventional approach, were reassured by the airline's improving financial performance. 3 months into the transformation, the difference at Polaris Air was palpable. The once stagnant atmosphere had been replaced with a sense of energy and optimism. Employees who had once dreaded coming to work now felt a renewed sense of purpose. During a surprise visit to the company's maintenance hub in Denver, Edward stopped to speak with a mechanic named Jake Patterson, who had been with Polaris Air for 15 years. "I've seen a lot of changes in this company," Jake said, wiping grease from his hands. "But this is the first time it feels like someone's actually listening to us. I didn't think it would matter, but it does." Edward nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "It matters more than you know," he replied. As Edward sat in his office one evening, reviewing the latest reports, he felt a rare sense of satisfaction. The numbers told a compelling story: higher customer retention, improved employee engagement, and growing revenue. But for Edward, the true measure of success wasn't just in the data. It was in the conversations he had with people like Jake, the subtle shifts in the way employees carried themselves, and the emails from passengers praising their experiences. Polaris Air wasn't just an airline anymore. It was a testament to what could happen when a company prioritized its people and its purpose. And for the first time in a long time, Edward felt that he was building something that would last. The office lights of Polaris Air's Chicago headquarters burned late into the night, as they often did when Edward Whitehall was working. The desk in his corner office was clutter-free, save for a glass of water, a closed laptop, and a thin leather-bound journal that he had taken to carrying in recent weeks. Outside his window, the city shimmered with life. But inside, Edward felt an unfamiliar stillness, a sense of being suspended between triumph and emptiness. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the journal. It had been a gift from Amanda Sloan, his financial strategist, who had handed it to him after an unusually reflective conversation. "You're always focused on the future," she had said. "Maybe it's time to start documenting the journey." At the time, Edward had dismissed the gesture as unnecessary, but now the blank pages felt like an invitation to confront thoughts he couldn't escape. His recent successes, transforming Polaris Air, improving employee morale, and earning public praise, had brought him everything he thought he wanted. And yet, there was a gnawing feeling that something was missing. The first cracks had appeared during a quarterly board meeting 2 weeks earlier. The presentation had gone smoothly. Profits were up, customer satisfaction scores had risen, and employee retention rates had improved. The board applauded Edward's leadership, showering him with praise for accomplishing what few thought possible. But as Edward listened, a hollow feeling began to grow in his chest. He had achieved everything he set out to do, yet their words felt distant, almost meaningless. The applause faded into background noise as a troubling thought surfaced. What's next? For years, Edward had thrived on the pursuit of success. He had defined himself by his ability to outmaneuver competitors, seize opportunities, and reshape industries. But now, with Polaris Air soaring under his leadership, he couldn't ignore the question that had begun to haunt him. Was all of this enough? Later that evening, Edward found himself scrolling through old emails on his personal laptop, a rare departure from his usual work routine. Among them, he stumbled across a chain of messages with his late mentor, Harold Grayson, a retired investor who had taken Edward under his wing early in his career. In one email, Harold had written, "Edward, ambition is a powerful tool, but it can also become a prison. The key is to know when to chase and when to build something worth staying for. Don't let the pursuit of power rob you of the moments that make life meaningful." Edward stared at the words, feeling the weight of their truth. Harold had been the one to encourage him to take risks, to think bigger than anyone else, but he had also warned against the cost of endless striving. At the time, Edward had brushed off those concerns, convinced that success would be its own reward. Now he wasn't so sure. The following day, Edward invited Victor Turner, his trusted attorney and longtime confidant, to dinner at a quiet restaurant away from the city's buzz. Victor had been with him through every major victory, and Edward valued his perspective more than anyone else's. Over a bottle of red wine, Victor noticed Edward's unusually subdued demeanor. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Edward swirled his glass, staring into the dark liquid. "Do you ever wonder if we've been climbing the wrong ladder?" Victor raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize you had doubts about the ladder you built." "It's not doubt," Edward clarified. "It's more reflection. I've spent my life chasing success, and I've achieved more than most people could dream of. But now that I'm here, I can't help but wonder, what's it all for?" Victor leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You've always been a builder, Edward, but maybe it's not about what you've built. Maybe it's about what you leave behind." The words lingered in the air, stirring something deep within Edward. He had always been focused on the immediate, closing deals, winning battles, proving his worth. The idea of legacy, of building something that transcended his own ambitions, felt foreign yet compelling. That weekend, Edward decided to take a rare day off. He drove to a nearby nature reserve, leaving behind the constant hum of his phone and the pressures of the office. The crisp air and towering trees provided a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in months. As he walked along the winding trails, he thought about the people who had been part of his journey. His mentor Harold, Victor, Amanda, even Clara Harper. Each had played a role in shaping the person he had become. Clara's dismissal had been a turning point, a stark reminder of the power he wielded and the consequences of his decisions. But it had also been a moment of growth, pushing him to reevaluate how he used that power. Sitting on a weathered bench overlooking a serene lake, Edward finally opened the journal Amanda had given him. For the first time, he began to write, not about numbers or strategies, but about what truly mattered to him. "I've built an empire, but I've yet to find peace. The victories are fleeting, and the applause fades quickly. Perhaps the answer isn't in chasing the next success, but in creating something that lasts, something that makes a difference." When Edward returned to the office on Monday, his focus had shifted. He called a meeting with Amanda and Sophia Martinez, the head of employee training, to discuss the next phase of Polaris Air's transformation. "We've improved the numbers," Edward said, "but now we need to focus on the people. not just their performance, but their purpose. Amanda tilted her head. What exactly are you proposing? A mentorship program, Edward replied. We have experienced employees who've been with the company for decades. Let's pair them with younger staff, not just to train them, but to inspire them. Sophia nodded. It's ambitious, but it could foster a real sense of community. It might even address some of the disconnect we've seen in the culture audit. And it's just the beginning, Edward added. I want Polaris Air to stand for more than efficiency and profit. We need to invest in sustainability, community outreach, and education. If we're going to leave a legacy, it has to be one that people remember for the right reasons. Over the next several weeks, Edward threw himself into these new initiatives with the same intensity he had once reserved for acquisitions. He partnered with environmental organizations to reduce Polaris Air's carbon footprint, launched scholarship programs for aspiring aviation professionals, and encouraged employees to participate in volunteer projects. For the first time, Edward felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond the boardroom. He began to see Polaris Air not just as a company, but as a force for good, a reflection of the values he had once buried beneath ambition. One evening, as Edward walked through the bustling terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, he paused to observe a scene that would have gone unnoticed by most. A flight attendant, an older woman with silver hair, was showing a young trainee how to calm a nervous passenger. The trainee nodded, her confidence visibly growing under the mentor's guidance. Edward smiled, feeling a quiet sense of pride. For the first time, the empire he had built didn't feel like a monument to his own success. It felt like a foundation for something greater, and for Edward Whitehall, that made all the difference. The Caribbean sun filtered through the curtains of Edward Whitehall's beachfront villa, casting golden streaks across the room. The gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore provided a stark contrast to the chaos of his life back in Chicago. For the first time in years, Edward had stepped away from the relentless grind of his career, taking a self-imposed sabbatical to reflect on the path he had carved for himself. It had been Amanda Sloan who suggested the break after their last meeting. Edward, you've spent the past year transforming Polaris Air, she had said. But you can't lead a company based on respect and sustainability if you're running on fumes. Take some time. We'll keep things steady. Though reluctant at first, Edward eventually saw the wisdom in her words. He packed lightly, left Victor Turner in charge of overseeing key operations, and retreated to a private villa on a quiet island. The trip was meant to be restorative, but as the days passed, it became clear that this time away would be transformative. The villa was modest by Edward's standards, with whitewashed walls and a sprawling view of the turquoise ocean. His days began with long walks along the shoreline, the sand cool beneath his feet in the early mornings. In these quiet moments, he allowed himself to think, not about numbers, strategies, or board meetings, but about life. He wrote extensively in the leather-bound journal Amanda had given him, filling its pages with observations, ideas, and questions that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. What is success without purpose? What is power without responsibility? I've built empires, but have I built anything that truly matters? One afternoon, while sitting on the villa's shaded veranda, Edward struck up a conversation with Daniel Osei, the property's caretaker. A former teacher who had moved to the island years ago, Daniel had an easy demeanor and a knack for storytelling. Over cups of strong local coffee, the two men shared their vastly different life experiences. You've achieved so much, Daniel remarked one day, gesturing toward Edward's tablet, which displayed news coverage of Polaris Air's recent accomplishments. But what's the legacy you want to leave behind? The question lingered long after their conversation ended. Edward realized that while he had been celebrated for his business acumen, he had rarely considered how his actions affected the world beyond the balance sheet. He began to think not just about what Polaris Air could achieve as a company, but about the kind of impact it could have on communities, employees, and the environment. By the time Edward returned to Chicago, his mind was clearer than it had been in years. The decisions he had made during his time away weren't just about transforming Polaris Air. They were about transforming himself. He had realized that his wealth and influence weren't just tools for achieving success, but opportunities to create lasting change. Within days of his return, Edward convened a meeting with his executive team. The atmosphere in the conference room was a mix of anticipation and curiosity. Sophia Martinez, the head of training, sat beside Amanda Sloan, while Victor Turner observed quietly from the corner. Edward began without preamble. Over the past year, we've focused on stabilizing Polaris Air, on improving efficiency, customer satisfaction, and employee engagement. And we've succeeded. But it's not enough. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. We're going to take this company further. Polaris Air will not just be an airline. It will be a symbol of what's possible when a business prioritizes respect, sustainability, and purpose. Sophia leaned forward, intrigued. What does that look like in practice? Edward outlined his vision with characteristic precision. 1. Sustainability at the core. Polaris Air would transition to a greener fleet, investing in sustainable aviation fuel and exploring partnerships with clean energy innovators. Carbon offset programs would be expanded, with transparent reporting for passengers. 2. Community investment. The company would dedicate a portion of its profits to education initiatives, particularly in underserved areas. Scholarships would be established for aspiring aviation professionals, and employees would be encouraged to volunteer in their local communities. 3. Employee empowerment. Building on the progress made in employee engagement, Polaris Air would introduce leadership development programs, ensuring every staff member had the opportunity to grow within the company. 4. Passenger-centered innovation. Edward envisioned an airline where passengers felt truly cared for, with personalized service and an unwavering commitment to comfort and reliability. This isn't just about making Polaris Air a better airline, Edward concluded. It's about making it a better company for everyone it touches. Not everyone in the room was immediately on board. Mark Hendricks, the VP of Operations, raised a hand. Edward, I appreciate the ambition, but these changes will require significant investment. How do we ensure shareholders stay happy? Edward met his gaze evenly by proving that purpose-driven business is profitable. When we show our passengers and employees that we stand for something greater, the results will follow. Mark still looked skeptical, but he nodded, recognizing the determination in Edward's tone. The next several months were a flurry of activity. Edward worked closely with Amanda and Sophia to implement the new initiatives, starting with the sustainability projects. Engineers began retrofitting planes for fuel efficiency, while marketing teams launched campaigns highlighting Polaris Air's commitment to a greener future. At the same time, the company rolled out its community investment programs. Edward personally visited schools in underserved neighborhoods, meeting students who would benefit from Polaris Air scholarships. Seeing their excitement and hope reminded him why this mission mattered. One day, while visiting a Polaris Air hub in Denver, Edward struck up a conversation with Grace Lynn, a junior flight attendant who had joined the company 6 months earlier. Honestly, I wasn't sure about this job at first, Grace admitted. But the changes you've made, especially the mentorship program, they've made such a difference. It feels like we're part of something bigger. Her words stayed with Edward. He realized that the culture he had worked so hard to build was finally taking root. Employees weren't just clocking in and out. They were proud to be part of Polaris Air. As Polaris Air continued to evolve, the industry began to take notice. Articles praised the company's innovative approach, and awards soon followed, recognizing Polaris Air as a leader in both sustainability and employee engagement. But for Edward, the real reward wasn't the accolades. It was the knowledge that he was building something meaningful. One evening, back in a Chicago office, Edward opened his journal and wrote, "Today, I saw the results of a vision that once felt impossible. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new way of leading, a new way of building. And for the first time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Edward's renewed mission didn't just transform Polaris Air, it transformed him. He was no longer the man who had acquired the airline out of frustration. He was a leader who understood the power of purpose, and he was determined to use that power to leave a legacy that would endure. The skies had always been Polaris Air's domain. Now, under Edward Whitehall's leadership, they symbolized something far greater: hope innovation, and the limitless potential of a shared vision. The hum of planes taking off and landing filled the air outside Polaris Air's headquarters. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Under Edward Whitehall's leadership, Polaris Air had transformed into more than an airline. It had become a symbol of innovation, integrity, and respect. Every corner of the company reflected the cultural shift that Edward had envisioned, and the results spoke louder than any words could. Edward stood by the large window in his office, overlooking the bustling Chicago O'Hare terminal. It was an ordinary scene. Travelers rushing to catch flights, ground crews deftly maneuvering equipment, and planes gliding effortlessly into the sky. Yet to Edward, it represented something extraordinary. It was the culmination of years of hard work, introspection, and transformation, a vision brought to life. The journey hadn't been easy. The challenges had been many, from the initial resistance of Polaris Air's leadership to the daunting task of reshaping its culture. But Edward had tackled each obstacle with the determination of a man who had not only something to prove, but something to give. Along the way, he had discovered a truth that had eluded him for most of his career. Success without purpose is hollow. Polaris Air had become an extension of that purpose. Its once mediocre reputation had been replaced with one of excellence and care. Passengers wrote glowing reviews about attentive flight crews, improved services, and the airline's newfound commitment to sustainability. The sleek new fleet of eco-friendly aircraft was not just a practical upgrade, but a statement of responsibility, a declaration that Polaris Air cared about the world beyond its profits. The employees, too, had felt the change. Mentorship programs paired seasoned veterans with young recruits, fostering a sense of camaraderie and growth. Grace Lynn, the flight attendant who had once doubted her place in the company, was now a lead trainer, inspiring new hires with her story of perseverance. Pilots, engineers, and ground staff worked with a renewed sense of pride, knowing they were part of something greater. Edward's transformation didn't go unnoticed. The media had once painted him as a ruthless billionaire, but now they celebrated him as a visionary leader. In interviews, he spoke candidly about the lessons he had learned. "I used to believe success was about winning," he had said in one interview. "Now I know it's about creating opportunities, creating connections, and creating something that lasts." His words resonated far beyond the business world. Emails poured in from people who had found inspiration in his journey. Entrepreneurs rethinking their goals, students dreaming bigger, and even employees from rival companies who longed for leadership that valued purpose as much as profit. One evening, Edward attended a gala celebrating Polaris Air's achievements. The grand ballroom was filled with employees, community leaders, and industry partners, all gathered to honor what the airline had become. As he stepped onto the stage to deliver a speech, he felt a wave of emotion. "Tonight isn't about me," he began, his voice steady but warm. "It's about all of you, the people who believed in this vision and made it a reality. Polaris Air isn't just an airline anymore. It's a promise that respect, innovation, and purpose can transform not just a company, but lives." The crowd erupted into applause, and Edward stepped back, letting the moment sink in. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of peace. The applause wasn't for him. It was for what they had built together. Back in his office later that night, Edward reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of Clara Harper, the flight attendant whose actions had set everything in motion. Her dismissal had been a painful but necessary step in Polaris Air's transformation. Yet, Edward couldn't deny the pivotal role she had played in his own evolution. Clara's life had taken a different path after leaving Polaris Air. She had found her footing in community organizing, advocating for workers' rights in high-stress industries. While their paths hadn't crossed again, Edward often thought of her, wondering if she realized how profound her impact had been. He knew that without their fateful encounter, he might never have questioned his approach to leadership or his definition of success. Clara had been the catalyst, a reminder that even small moments can ignite great change. The years ahead held endless possibilities for Polaris Air. Edward's vision extended far beyond its current successes. He dreamed of further innovations, deeper investments in sustainability, and a legacy that would endure long after his tenure. But for now, he allowed himself a rare moment to pause and appreciate how far they had come. As he sat at his desk, the leather-bound journal Amanda Sloan had given him lay open. Flipping through its pages, Edward reread the entries he had written during his sabbatical. The questions, the reflections, the ideas that had shaped his journey. On a blank page, he picked up a pen and wrote, "Legacy isn't built on what you take, but on what you give." Today, Polaris Air stands as proof that transformation is possible, not just for a company, but for a leader. And as I look to the future, I know the best is yet to come. Edward leaned back, looking out at the city lights beyond his window. Polaris Air was thriving, its employees were thriving, and for the first time, he felt like he was thriving too. This wasn't the end of the story. It was a new beginning, and it was a legacy he was proud to leave behind. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this inspiring story. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more meaningful tales like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.